I would appreciate both your points of view on this. What I think would be very useful for the committee would be an explanation of what is different in relation to the rest of the UK about the ports of Wales from the inside of Wales perspective, but also, Mishanka, from your perspective as well.
Yes, okay. From my perspective, I think what you'd say is that within Wales, the key part is the role that Welsh ports play on the Irish land bridge. Mm-hmm. So a sizable proportion of trade that comes in and out of Ireland, certainly stuff that goes by road, comes through either the Port Holyhead in the north or Pembroke or Fishguard in the south. And so consequently, those ports have a key role to play in that land bridge. But also this traffic therefore means that for the local economies in those areas, they play a key role as well. They're big employers, and contribute therefore to the local economy as well. So that's the sort of real feature of Welsh ports. Obviously some of the other ports serve more general cargo and some are quite specific. So again, Milford Haven, for instance, is the main oil import location for the whole of the UK. But obviously that comes generally from outside the EU to start with, so the impact there of Brexit will be much less than other places.
Yeah, I wouldn't have much to add to that. I would agree that Welsh ports play an incredibly important role in serving that land bridge between Ireland and the rest of the EU. And I think it's something like 80% of goods, Irish exports that go to the EU via the UK go via Welsh ports, and a similar figure in the other direction. So that is a crucial feature of Welsh ports from an outside of Wales perspective as well.
Okay, and I think those of us who know Welsh ports know that the infrastructure as things stand is evidently able to cope with the customs checks they're required to implement. How would you anticipate if there were a need to conduct customs checks on goods coming in at Fishguard and Holyhead primarily? How do you think they would be able to cope? And to what degree would you say there has been sufficient preparation, given that we're 164 days or so away from what is now, Germany is preparing for a no-deal Brexit, so what is now quite a reasonable expectation?
Okay. In terms of the infrastructure, I say since the start of the single market, the ports have generally sort of reshaped their operations to reflect the fact that they don't need to do the checks. And what that has meant is that, for instance, where checks occur, like the security check that has to take place anyway, they've been moved into sort of locations that work better for a smooth flow through. What seems to be the case is that there is potentially less space available at the ports for these additional checks, which therefore means that, for instance, vehicles would have to wait outside of the port area before they go in, or if they're coming off the vessel, potentially have to stay on the vessel until the queue clears. So I think there are some concerns over space. I think from what I've picked up is Pembroke perhaps is less affected by that. They've got a bit more area where they can handle the vehicles compared to Holyhead and Fishguard. So I think there will be challenges, and it's a case of equally I'm sure the port operators have to start to think about this. Again, what I've picked up is that whilst they have been planning for this, physical sort of infrastructure changes haven't taken place yet, particularly any of the ports, because of some of the uncertainty over which outcome from the Brexit negotiations is going to come. Whilst obviously they'll have in mind what they need to do if there was a no-deal Brexit and substantial checks were needed. Being private firms, they've got to obviously make an investment, and their shareholders and owners wouldn't necessarily want you to invest in something that then doesn't happen. So the uncertainty hasn't helped, although I think since the Chequers Agreement, where effectively you've narrowed it down to a much more limited range of options, that has helped now focus the minds a bit as to what might need to be done.
Would you like to add anything on that in terms of the infrastructure that might be needed?
Okay. Well, I say effectively at the minute, vessels, if we look at export vessels, they have, if they're going on the ro-ro ferries, they have to have a security check currently. With sort of no-deal Brexit, you're looking there at you'd have to have the animal checks, and potentially you'd need those for the facilitated customs area anyway, so any animal or plant-based products would have to have an additional check. Beyond that, you would then have customs checks to do as well if there was a no-deal barrier. So all of these checks effectively add a bit of time, and one truck on its own isn't a problem. It's when you multiply that by the 200-300 you get on a particular ferry arrival that the problems come. So the infrastructure you effectively need are parking areas for trucks to queue in, waiting to get through the various checks and the checkpoint. So it's ultimately land is the key infrastructure requirement to some extent, to put the trucks in ahead of their depart, either before the check or after it, or even both, because what you'll find, I think, is that operators will change their habits. That if there's going to be a queue, they'll arrive earlier at the port, which then means you need to make sure you've got the space for them after the checks, but before the boat arrives.
So in effect, Anglesey becomes a car park.
Parts of Anglesey become a car park.
Thank you. If I could then ask you, the changes to the trade and customs arrangements at UK level, how do you think they may affect Wales? Do you think that disproportionately they're going to affect Wales, and how, in what way?
I mean, it's difficult to judge exactly because, again, we're talking a lot of the implications for the UK will equally apply to Wales. I think where it will become a bit more disproportionate perhaps is a lot of Welsh trade goes to Europe, either Ireland one way or mainland Europe in the other direction. So you may well see some issues there. Equally, the Welsh economy has got a strong agricultural foundation, and that's really where there's a potential for extra checks to do with the making sure the animals are being kept well and all those kinds of checks. So that's where I think you'll see particular impacts. Is it disproportionate to the rest of the UK? I suspect there will be some sectors where it is disproportionate, and there's other ones that are less affected as a result.
Okay.
So to pick up on that, I agree that in terms of exports to the EU, Wales might be disproportionately affected in the sense that 60% of Welsh goods exports go to the EU, only about 40% of the UK's goods exports go to the EU. In particular sectors, as Andrew said, the agricultural sector is very important to the Welsh economy. 80%, I think, of agricultural exports go to the EU, and that kind of increases to 90% if we're talking about meat products and stuff like that. So that in that sense, yes. Equally, looking at the other kind of side of that goods economy, the manufacturing side of that, Wales, like the rest of the UK, I would say, the manufacturing industry in Wales is primarily concentrated in high-value, high-tech manufacturing. Probably the perfect example of that is the Airbus supply line, and that is one particular pinch point that Wales will experience, because, as I understand it, the Airbus plant in Wales is the only one that supplies Airbus wings for the EU manufacturing line. So if we're talking about and let's
just in time.
Yeah, exactly. So aerospace supply chains are very, very unique in that it's not just a highly regulated sector. This is a sector that relies on just-in-time production. Component parts arrive an hour before they're necessary on the production line and are used. So if there is any additional friction in that system, and it can be small, it reduces the competitiveness of the particular Welsh business of Airbus, of the Airbus plant in Broughton in this case, in that supply chain, and and that will have a disproportionate effect therefore on Wales.
Okay.
You could be, from what you're saying, you could be left in a ridiculous situation where you've got the body of the plane sitting in Toulouse and the wings up in North Wales, and it just not coming together at the right time. Is that being oversimplistic, or is that what we really mean?
Theoretically, yes, that could be a scenario. I would imagine that supply lines, manufacturers will start to shift their supply lines and will start to prepare in advance for that situation, and will begin onshoring some sort of production in the EU or in the UK as is necessary. But in theory.